Cool.
And that should be good enough because it has been in the past.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me. And you know what? Because it sounds good, I have to ask, is this just fantasy?
Yeah.
And your answer is?
It mostly, for the most part, is, yeah. But
it is fantasy. Yeah. I mean, I really, we can't deny that, honestly.
Mm-hmm. It all boils back down to this, baby.
But we like it.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, it's only rock and roll, but we like it. It's only fantasy, but we like it. And that's really enough, in my opinion.
I think so.
So you're Sean once again.
Yeah,
I think you still are from last time.
Well, yeah, I go by many names, but
right.
We'll call myself Sean for this all intents and purposes.
For the purposes of this conversation,
I'm Sean, and welcome to Is This Just Fantasy? I'm not the host. But I've got a lot of podcast experience, and I can't help but do a little intro there. So
that's fine. That's fine. That'll work. Somebody's got to take the reins, and it sure as hell ain't gonna be me. No. So I wanted to talk to you today, and it's funny because this topic in particular is kind of the reason I started doing this in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
This is a conversation. This is a topic that I've been thinking a lot about and talking about with people in various forums personally and all that.
Oh, wow.
And that is where the flip are all of the fantasy comics.
Mm-hmm.
Because comics as a medium, just like all mediums, like, the written word and film and music and painting and everything.
It's got a variety. 10 more of those. Give me 10 more.
10 more. Podcasting. That's a medium, right? Games.
Yeah.
Both video games and board games.
Okay, cool.
Let's see here. Sculpture.
Dance, like expressive dance.
Sculpture. Sculpture, dance. Let's see here.
Like spoken word poetry,
spoken word poetry, jazz.
Down the rabbit hole are we going here?
I mean, I'm trying to the artistic making of guitars. Maybe there's some fantasy guitars out there.
Yeah,
but anyway,
lute carving or something.
Lute carving. Yeah, oh, absolutely, yes. But just like every medium, it's got a bunch of different, like, there's different forms or genres that take place in it. So comics, there's like sci-fi comics, there's history comics, there's romance, there's action, crime, mystery, horror, any genre you could think of, it's in comics, and that includes fantasy. This is a really curious thing to me. Is I would say what traditionally is viewed as fantasy. You could call it fantasy with medievalism as an aspect, or fantasy even just using magic, maybe like alternative world, alternative history, whatever, is lacking, generally speaking, in the field.
Sure.
If you ask, name 500 science fiction comics, you could probably name 500 science fiction comics.
Yeah, we won't do it because we don't have enough.
We won't do it,
but
right,
you could,
and I refuse.
I could maybe off the top of my head name, and I'm not an expert on this field, but maybe like 5 fantasy comics that I know of. So, it's one of those things where in researching in the past and in researching now for this particular topic, I was just, okay, what's out there? And I came up with a list of just stuff like, these are ones that either I have read or could read, or whatever, or know of. Can I do a character assessment and tell you one that I know is on your list?
Sure.
I'm gonna say By Chance or Providence by Becky Cloonan.
You're absolutely right. Yes.
I
Yeah,
knew
and
it.
that's a deep cut, honestly, because that's like
Mm,
it's for the most part, at least until recently, independently produced work
right.
by Austin, Texas resident Becky Cloonan,
Mm-hmm.
where we both live presently.
Yes. You're not supposed to tell them
Um,
that, but
oh, well, that's fine. I don't care. No, I what I love is so that's a great example of fantasy comics, but that's one. But the list is very short,
yeah, where's the rest?
and right, where's the rest? And even just back in the days when I would just go to the comic book store just for fun, I would look at, say, even just the new comic shelves,
Mm-hmm.
and the number of fantasy. It was always, there was a section for it. At least the big one of the big ones in town. There's a section for like fantasy, and it was a very small section,
Mm-hmm.
especially compared to everything else.
Right, right.
And a lot of them, it was like, this is a new comic like 5 years ago, and it's still sitting here because there's not a bunch of new ones.
Right.
And so but this is, I'd say, been a trend that's been consistent for the most part. I think that there's a few points historically where it kind of peaked, and there
Yeah.
were a lot more uh, than there are now. But at the present time, it's pretty on. I guess you might say it's on an uptick,
Right.
but very only slightly. It's just, again, in comparison, like, ask some, science fiction. There's
Mm-hmm.
tons. There's even a bunch of crime, and slice of life and all that
Yeah.
stuff. So like, it's so weird that fantasy as a genre is just underrepresented. And what's the deal with that?
So, okay, I've been thinking about this because you it was like a couple days ago that you asked me to record this episode with you, and uh, I mean, I haven't set foot in a comic shop in 8 9 months. Like, how long has COVID been going on? So, like, I mean, when COVID-19 started,
I'd say
since
about a year.
yeah, since then, I've not set foot in a comic shop. So, like, one, that sucks. I hate that. But
Right.
two, like, I mean, I've had to get all of my comic distribution off like Hoopla from like the Austin Library. Like, I have like a like a Kindle subscription to the Austin Library here, and I can like look at comics on on my iPad or whatever, and get subscriptions to like new and upcoming comics. But in like maybe the last year, some of the bigger comics that I've read, like I can only really think of one fantasy comic that I found that kind of surfaced and has taken a lot of quarantine by storm, and that's Lock and Key. I would
Well, that's
consider that
because of the
fantasy.
show that came out.
Right. It also,
Well, I'd say my roommate, who's a huge horror fan, by the way, and loves Lock and Key, would call it a horror book.
sure.
And when I said to her, you could classify a lot of horror as fantasy, she kind of gave me this look and bristled. And it's funny
Mm-hmm.
because people do that.
Right.
It's why whenever I've said, oh yeah, like the Marvel universe is a fantasy universe, people bristle.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh no, don't, no,
Right.
because fantasies for the lamos, sci-fi's for the
Mm-hmm.
cool nerds.
See, what you're talking about right now is like the plight of American comics forever. This like that's been the issue
Yeah,
since comics like began. I mean, like like I don't know, like just before this I like was just kind of brushing up on history of comics, and like um I took a course in college on um the hero's journey, and like the whole concept behind like the reason that we were obsessed with superheroes was because there was so much shit going on in the world that we wanted to like be superhuman and be able to combat these like mysterious scary forces. And there's a lot of parallels with superhero comics and fantasy work, just in the pure sense of like escapism and like larger than life desires. um and so, you know, you're speaking of being shoehorned into a specific category. Like, you know, some horror is fantasy or could be considered fantasy. Some superhero work like Marvel, you know, universe could be considered fantastical slash fantasy universe, and people get all bent out of shape about it. And I think that honestly is one of the biggest reasons that fantasy comics get a bad rap and don't necessarily appear in a prevalent way in the market. You know, it's crazy to me that simply by classifying something you can kind of like manipulate if it's going to be popular or not, and that's like half the battle. That's crazy.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's I think it's so funny to me because I just I think about like say like Thor
Uh-huh.
as a comic as like in the comics, especially in like old school ones, even up until I would say fairly recently. And when I say fairly recently, I mean like the last 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
which is crazy because the character's been around for eons,
Mm-hmm.
and especially not just in comic form, but it's always been magic rainbow bridge, magic hammer, like magic spells, enchantresses, and all. It's full fantasy,
Right.
100%. They're using swords and shields and shit.
Yeah.
They have one of the main characters rides on a winged horse. Like it's full fantasy,
Right.
with a strong connection to its mythic antiquity, and I'm like, I feel this, I'm into this, like I count that as fantasy. But I imagine most modern fans are like, no, it's advanced alien technology, and it's whatever. It's anything to escape the fact that it's just magic. Like
Yeah.
even and especially at like MCU, as much as I love them, like they bristle at the fantasy, which I get,
Mm-hmm.
because they need to have a world in which a man in a robotic suit and a person who can like wave his hands and create portals can stand next to each other, and it's not crazy. Like it is
Right.
it is still like they make a point like this is silly, but they also made a big effort in Doctor Strange to be like, oh no, it's multiple dimensions, which is a realistic thing, and
Mm-hmm.
it's tapping into that rather than like he's a wizard, because you can't just be a wizard.
But he is a wizard. He
But
is a
he is a
wizard,
wizard.
though.
He's the sorcerer supreme, and he has a wand
Yeah.
and a
And
magic cape.
you're gonna tell me that he has a magic cape and can do magic, but he's not a wizard? Don't try to bullshit me, dude. Like,
Don't gaslight me. I know what I wizard when I see one.
I can
So,
I can tell. Let me tell you.
so I have a theory.
Okay.
This is my main theory when it comes to why there aren't as many, because there's a lot of different genres out there, a lot of different things that can appeal to people.
Yeah.
Because first of all, I was thinking about it from this angle where what we were just talking about, like, oh, well, maybe it's not considered cool enough, or it doesn't sell as much as sci-fi, especially
Mm-hmm.
like in the 20th century, 21st century. It's like sci-fi, that's the main kind of genre
Right.
for fiction. That's what appeals to most people, and I can agree to that. But I don't think that's just it. I think that might be in part why more companies don't try to create fantasy comics. Because I also started wondering, is it the other end that needs to be examined? So not the production side of things, but the audience. So I started thinking about, okay, what is it like? Hey, fantasy fans,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Where are you at?
are you not drawn to a comic? Because there's been times where fantasy comics will pop up here and there, and they don't sell. And then part of me is like, well, it can't always be it's because the quality is bad.
Right.
It can't always be, and it can't, and sometimes it can't even say that it's because it's not marketed well, because there's things that have been marketed just as well as anything else on the stands, and still they don't sell. And so I started talking to friends of mine who are fans of fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And something that kind of kept coming up, and it's something that they would admit they didn't consciously consider when they were not picking up, say, a comic, or didn't even think about getting a fantasy comic. And it's that part of the appeal of fantasy is the imaginative element. And a lot of fantasy, whether it's a role-playing game or a novel, asks a lot of the reader to imagine.
Right.
And for many people, that's the appeal of it, is it engages their imagination, and they can imagine however they want. And even with, and that's why there's, let's just say, for example, a fantasy book series that's very popular. Let's say Harold Potter. Now that's a fantasy book series. Lots of fans. You can't say it's not popular.
Yep.
But there's a lot of people who love the books who are not fans of the movies, and I would say I'm probably one of them. And a lot of it, you could say, comes down to, well, I didn't imagine it that way.
Right.
Like, the way I imagined it was so much more interesting, so much more exciting, or even like I saw myself in this person's role, or whatever.
Right.
And part of me is like, well, maybe that's the appeal, is that it exists up here in my head. And when you give it a form, a specific form on the screen or on the page, if you will,
yeah,
it takes that away from you.
So,
you're not involved.
Okay, so
in the creation process.
This is super interesting to me. I've never even considered that. According to like why fantasy as a medium it's not dying, because it's not. It's still around. You can find it, but it's hard to do it right. And one example of someone who has done it well is the McElroy brothers, actually. And the reason that they've done it successfully is because they have a fan base that they've cultivated for years. And that's the same exact, like, train of thought, I guess, or like result as like Wizards of the Coast, or like, Dungeons and Dragons, or any role-playing game. Like, a role-playing game becomes successful because they allow and invite others to kind of build off of their system, or build off of like what they believe things to be. And the McElroy brothers did the Adventure Zone, and they let everyone and anyone that wanted to be a part of it kind of invent things and create characters within it, and they allowed people to kind of come into the universe and create this artwork that they felt suited the Adventure Zone. And then that became canon in their universe collaboratively with, like, Carrie Peach, who does the artwork for the Adventure Zone comics. And they're more of graphic novels, but like, it's the same vein. It is a fantasy comic because it's 1-to-1 a D&D session that the McElroy brothers played. And so like, that's a really cool concept, in that maybe it is the future for fantasy comics, is collaborative, fantasy, where we can all imagine a bit of it. I mean, do you remember Homestuck? Like, did you ever get involved in that?
I did not.
Mm-mm. I never directly involved myself in Homestuck, but it had such a cult following, and it was because people got to invent things as they went. So like, fantasy inherently is, imagination, like you said. If I can't imagine what I want to imagine, why am I bothering to exist in fantasy? Because it's like, that's the whole point of it. I can just escape and do whatever I want in this fantasy world. And for a while, everyone was sated, right? Like, oh, cool, other people are coming up with weird, like, vicarious comics that I can live in. But, it's kind of played out at a certain point. Like, you've got goblins, you've got orcs and warriors and paladins, and like, nobody's really coming up with new fantasy, because everyone comes up with new fantasy all the time.
That's actually a good point too. It's everybody's coming up with it on their own.
Yeah.
And I mean, not to say that like there's plenty of people who, like can say like even I can say that a lot of times if I'm reading a book or something like that, and if it's not overly descriptive of, say, a goblin, I have a specific look for a goblin in my head that I'll just attribute to it because like, oh, that's what I think of goblin, whatever, I'll put it there. So there's definitely stuff like that happens, but so I think some of the things you've hit upon make me think of something else that I've thought about because, spoiler alert, everybody, both Sean and I are people who endeavor to create fantasy comics.
Oh yeah.
So we're trying to fill the void that we perceive at least, and I think is there with fantasy genre work in comics, and something that, as far as there's fantasy comics that do exist.
Yeah.
And while I try to support as many of them as I can, there's some I can't bring myself to support because they suck. And
names. Come on, don't be afraid.
ElfQuest. ElfQuest, which is one of which I feel comfortable saying because ElfQuest is like the most successful fantasy comic ever. Because it's been around since at least the fucking 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, look at this.
Yeah.
But like it's actually the reason that I'm not. But yeah, it started in 1978 to 2018, so I guess it ended in 2018. For fuck's sake.
1978.
It was 1978 to 2018.
So that's the Bronze Age of comics. Like
that's a huge span of time. So one of the reasons that I don't say that I'm not into that, and that's because one of the things is there's very different subgenres and pieces to fantasy or even stylistic approaches to fantasy that I'm like I'm not into that. I'm more into this, whatever. But one of the reasons that I think there are some some comics that stand out to me as, oh man, that's how you do fantasy. This feels right, and I think that's a specific thing to fantasy that, in my opinion, is different from science fiction in that there's a feeling to fantasy.
Yeah,
there's a feeling to it that you guys like. If it was sci-fi, if you have an interesting enough story, like that can usually get you by, whether or not it has a certain feel to it or not. You can get by on just a story. With fantasy, it has to feel right.
Yeah.
And so when I started looking at like, okay, who are the artists and like creators that I really am drawn to when it comes to fantasy comics?
Can you hold on to that thought for a second?
Yes.
And just circle back around? When you say that fantasy has to feel right, I'm really curious to know like just like an elevator pitch of what like right fantasy feels like to you, because I have an idea in my head and I'm interested in yours, and then I'll share mine.
Sure. Yeah. So for me, fantasy feels right when there is a generous amount of mystery to things. There's a bit of danger to being out in the world. And while the people we are following may not always, be scrupulous, in fact, sometimes the world is so harsh that they need to be deceptive or use their wily nature to get by.
Yeah.
It's a world that requires if you're going to be exceptional, you need to be smart, and you need to try harder. I don't know, like I guess I'm getting now into like the plots that I enjoy, but basically the world itself needs to feel like there's still some mystery in there. There's still some danger, Like so much of it to me is very visual. It's it's misty forests and like kind of like hazy nights.
Is that danger that you mentioned, like, it almost sounded apocalyptic to me, like the way you describe it. Would you say that's somewhat accurate?
Maybe.
Like, I mean, the world outside of, civilization or outside of the safety of a city or town is like fraught with danger. And like, Thomas goes next town over and is murdered by, kobolds or some shit. Like, oh, Thomas is dead. We have to bury him. Like, but meanwhile, there's another, town 2 miles away that's on fire from like bandits or something. Like consistently dangerous like that, or more just like that the world is dangerous.
The world is dangerous. That like the dangers are chaotic and unpredictable. There are places where you can feel at peace, and places that are insulated for that sort of thing. But just that the world, that there is some wonder to be had as well as some fear.
Yeah.
At what's in the world, and I think that's the balance that really it needs to feel, is that there's a sense of wonder and there's a sense of mystery.
Mm-hmm. So when is SideQuesters going to be available? When are you launching that?
I'm launching that as soon as I can. I'm looking for. I'm trying to get preparing my pitch for publishers right now.
Okay.
Because I have 3 issues done at present, and I was waiting to have like a lead on things before I move on. But I'm gonna do something. Of course.
Are your issues just like standard trade, like 20 pages? So, or...
The first one I think is like 26, but then the rest of them have been about 24. I'm trying to stick to that just because I like that, as it just feels like chapters of a story, and it's a good way to break it up. But like my favorite authors, I try to have like, hey, if you bought this one issue, you'll feel satisfied in what happens, but it'll hopefully get you hooked and interested in what's going to happen next, which is what most individual issue comics should be for me.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So what's your concept of like the appropriate feel of fantasy for you?
I mean, I've spent 11 years doing groundwork just to figure that out for the universe of Amara, but like for me, so much of fantasy has like there's a world that exists, and the world has rules and laws.
There we go.
And like,
that's a good one.
Like everything that happens in the world will happen regardless of anyone that lives in it, because the world has an agenda and the world has wants and desires. And like, I mean, that's what I'm doing with Welcome to Amara, the podcast, and everything. Like, I'm really trying to hammer home the idea that like my buddy Andy is playing a character in the universe that I've invented, and he exists outside of the world, and nothing that he does in the game will change Amara, but everything that happens in the game will change his character for better or for worse. And like, I think that that's a big thing about fantasy that some kind of publications will miss. I mean, to take, for example, Becky Cloonan, like she's written 3 short stories. It's been a while since I've read them, but like they're all about like the external that's occurring outside of the character that we're seeing. So like we're following some journey with the character. I mean, I guess with the exception of the werewolf story, the short werewolf story. There's the other story about, you know, this massive castle, and there's a woman and her like son. Man, it's been so long since I've read them, but like just that the world itself has agency, and that's where I think a lot of fantasy content misses the mark, at least that's published, because it's all like drama nowadays. Like it's all about the person, or it's all about the adventure of blank, and like you follow this one guy around and he's like the hero, and it's like, well, that's every superhero comic that's ever been made. Like,
Right.
not super into that. But if you show me a dangerous world that like reveals truths or terror from within the world itself, I think that's super cool, and that's what fantasy looks like to me.
See, something a little bit that you said there that reminded me of something else that's really important to me is the world needs to feel lived in.
Mm-hmm.
As mysterious and wondrous as it can be, I want it to feel like there's regular people there too, that are struggling to get by or succeeding or whatever, but just it needs to feel like a real place, because that's for me because that's to me what's important about the escapist aspect, is that it feels like a real place that I can escape to, rather than this smear of a world that really has nothing to it.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. So in going back to representing that world, I'm mostly speaking visually, because there's certain comics that I'm drawn to, and then I started thinking about, okay, what fantasy art do I enjoy, or what's a commonality of fantasy art that a lot of people like, and I was thinking of different artists, and a commonality seems like, to me, is the fantasy artists that I think have the broadest appeal, and that also not only have the broadest appeal, but also have the appeal of fellow artists, and really kind of capture people's imagination, are people that they don't overdo the detail.
Yeah.
So two I would say fine artists that I would point to, which are 20th century artists, are Frank Frazetta and J. Catherine Jones.
And what universes are they known for?
What universe? A lot of the work that they may be known for is these are fine artists, but they've done a lot of artwork for the covers of fantasy books, specifically Conan the Barbarian, especially for Frazetta. And one of the things that is notable about their work is, well, one, it's very the physicality of all the figures is accurate, but yet heightened.
A little preposterous.
But also in the worlds that they inhabit have a haze to them. They have an openness to them. Like there's this great illustration that Frazetta did of Grendel. Grendel overlooking Hrothgar, or High Hrothgar, Hrothgar's the name of the king in Beowulf. I'm fucked up. Anyway, it's looking over the like the mead hall / place, and in between the foreground figure, which we just see his back, and the mead hall, it's only very hazily represented. It's not like meticulously rendered like forests or sea or anything like that.
Right.
The two things in focus are the things that we need to know, which is the monster and their goal.
Yeah.
And I think what that does on a both, I'd say, sometimes conscious but also subconscious level, is it invites the viewer fill in those gaps.
See, that's something. I mean, you mentioned mystery specifically as being important to a fantasy world for you, and I think that there's so much truth in that because of exactly what we've been talking about. You want to be able to invite someone into a fantasy world and say, fill in the blanks, or here's something that is like a suggestion of the world that we're in. Now, your imagination is going to do the job and get the dopamine and the reward for like trying to piece it together or trying to figure out the real truths of this universe. Like, Dungeons and Dragons does that. I mean, like the whole premise of role-playing tabletop RPGs is like, here's some information, now figure out the rest. Or like specifically Dungeon World, there's a tenet in Dungeon World that is leave blanks, and I think that that's the biggest benefit of that system is, you know, as a seasoned DM, like you play Dungeons and Dragons and you plan everything out for 6 hours beforehand, and like Dungeon World is like, plan out 3 things, pick like 3 things that you want to investigate, and if they don't get investigated, there's a whole universe out there to fill out and flesh out. Like I think that's a great tenet that we could incorporate into fantasy, and perhaps even is one of the reasons that fantasy is not as prominent as it once was. I think of like all the books that were written in like the golden age of fantasy that are exactly what you're describing with, you know, we spoke about Piers Anthony, but like, I mean, the dude wrote Xanth, and he wrote 999 books, and each and every one of them, it was like a formula. He like had a piece of paper on his desk, I guarantee you, that just said like sex appeal, mystery, and a little bit of magic sometimes. Like,
yeah.
And that's it. Like, go any deeper than that, and now you're inventing new IP. And like, if you season it up a little bit with some spices and make it different, that's science fiction, or that's, you know, horror, or, you know, whatever. I mean,
right.
Fantasy is a root, and
yeah,
that's
I think the lack of specificity is a strength to fantasy stories. There's something in fantasy stories that get, you know, very meticulous, especially like, I think to say detail doesn't matter is not completely accurate, because I think there are certain details that definitely matter. Like when, like it's just saying, like in the written word, like when an author's describing like the hilt of a sword, say it's a special sword, like coming up with like a very specific thing that the person could visualize. It's like, okay, you have certain visual anchors. Like, okay, that's a thing I can picture on my own, solidified, so that when I see somebody draw it or paint it, I know exactly what sword it is.
Yeah, when you
know,
get
that kind of thing.
The one ring to rule them all, like described ad nauseum over 12 pages, like
you're gonna know what it looks like.
You're gonna know next time you see that thing.
Yeah, and I think that's where I can come back to comics, in that for me, and it might just be me, but I also think that there may be something to it with other fantasy fans, is I think if a fantasy comic's going to work, if it's going to feel right, the art needs to feel right for it. And so I've said it a bunch of times, you can't draw a fantasy story like you could draw any other story in comics. Like there needs to be something special. There needs to be something different about it. Okay,
hold on a second. I'm going to, really quick, this is going to be great podcast audio, but I'm going to go over to my comic stand that I bought at an antique store. I'm going to spin it and look for a comic that I think really represents it, because I know the name of the comic, but I don't know the creators off the top of my head. So sure. 5 seconds. Here we go.
Go for it.
Ooh, sorry, bumped the mic there. Really good podcast audio here. This is
it's fine.
A comic called Mirror. Do you know Mirror?
Mirror, is that Dave McKean?
No, it is, I'm looking at it right now. It is Emma Rios and Hui Lim. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but they created a fantasy comic called Mirror, and it's actually one of the most unique fantasy comics that I've seen in a while. Once COVID is over, I'm going to let you borrow it. It is entirely done in watercolor. And
I'm seeing it. I'm seeing the images on, I'm looking them up as we're talking.
They really, really pushed the boundaries of like paneling and showing you exactly what they want you to see, but leaving everything else kind of vague. there's a lot of characters in it that like are depicted as like ambiguous animals. Like there's like dog people and like bears that have like humanity, and they kind of transition between like, you know, a standard dog, like just plain animal, into these more like humanoid creatures. So it kind of gives this really nice sense of like vague, like, are these things being imagined, or are they real? Is it like part of the magic of the universe? Like, what, you know, what's going on in this? And I'm trying to keep things vague on purpose so that I don't really spoil anything in the comic. But
story wise,
yeah, story wise, it's great though.
Just looking at the images that come up when I just search the term mirror comic, this is you know, on the same, this is where the direction that I think is a good direction to go when it comes to fantasy comics. Which, one, there's a strong sense of what I like to call the artist hand, where you can see the paint strokes, you can see it as like ink lines. That always appeals to me. But something else that I think is appealing about it is that, yeah, like there's a lot of openness, there's a lot of suggestion, there's a lot of letting the reader kind of invent the periphery, fill in the gaps. And I think like a very open style like that is appealing. I mean, a very famous example of one which I think works. I think it's because the art style is specific enough to be memorable, but open enough to be inviting for a reader, and that's Bone by Jeff Smith, which a lot of people may consider the best fantasy comic ever done, and it may be.
Yeah.
But that's another example where it's like it's specific enough to where it feels like this is a world in which these people actually live, but yet it's open enough to where, yeah, like what exactly is going on with one of these Bone characters, and but also just, yeah, like the way even the way individual pages are rendered is a kind of a magic in and of itself. I mean, of course, there's artists that I can point to that it should be no surprise to you for me to mention, like Mike Mignola, who Mignola's I would say impressionism, or expressionism, German expressionism, you could say, invites the reader to turn what upon first inspection could be just a vague set of shapes, which he would phrase it this way: is Hellboy is just a bunch of shapes that I like to draw.
Yeah,
and that's really all he is. But that turns it into a character. Right. He actually did an adaptation earlier in his career that's maybe my favorite, if it's not the favorite, it's up there, of fantasy comics. It's an adaptation of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which is like a Fritz Leiber set of characters that has had several comic adaptations, including, I think, for DC they did like their own ongoing comic for a while, because the 70s, I will say, was the high point for fantasy comics. 70s, 80s.
I had like one, I think, exposure to Fafhrd, and I believe it was in college. There's a wizard character in it? Yes.
Not like a long-standing one, but there are.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but is there like a old man who's like covered in bird shit all the time? Or no?
If there is, I don't remember.
Okay, I may be thinking of something entirely different then.
I mean, it sounds like Radicast to me. I know you're not thinking of that.
It was Radicast. I'm just getting my comics confused. I was once compared to Radicast. So.
Oh my god, covered in bird shit.
In college I went to a lot of conventions like Gen Con and stuff, and at one of the old Renaissance fairs that I went to, I got a gigantic wizard's hat, and it looks exactly like a wizard hat covered in bird shit just because of the way that it was felted.
Oh my God.
So I was wandering around and someone called me out and they're like, "Hey, are you cosplaying Radagast?" And I was like, "No, huh?" And then they explained it to me and I was like, "Well, that seems pretty cool, but no. Maybe I will someday."
Maybe someday.
Some I can't remember exactly what it was that made me think of this, but this is a very perhaps deep dive question about fantasy comics, because we were on the topic of like what makes a fantasy comic appear like pleasing to you and I. But do you think that there's a really good pacing formula for fantasy comics, like even deep into like comic theory, like comic paneling and like pacing of paneling, like moments to moments, or like action to action or scene to scene? Like I've read a comic called Tarot. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one. Have you ever heard anything about that?
I mean, it depends on the spelling.
Tarot. I don't think there's two R's.
Oh, wait. Okay. It's probably...
Hold on. I discovered it in a publication of Island, which is a compilation comic that is like a quarterly comic that takes probably 8 to 10 different artists and just like does an anthology kind of thing. If you type in tarot comic,
that's I mean, I don't think it's what you're talking about, or it might be.
It might be really hard to find because I've only ever seen it in a few publications here and there, and I'm not really sure. It's not
actually. I'm going to advise people, don't Google tarot comic.
Okay.
Because it is a smut book.
Is it Witch of the Black Rose?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a fantasy That's a fantasy comic.
All right. Well,
however, it's like also an exploitation comic.
Oh yeah. See, no, backing out.
100%. Yeah.
The Wikipedia page and the image on the Wikipedia is okay. No. Anyhow, the use of paneling and magic in this comic, and I'll look it up and I'll see if I can send you a link to it or something. But it's amazing the playfulness that they use in creating like place to place paneling, like incorporated magic into the panel structure of the page. And like there was even a certain point where someone cast a ray of magic like to teleport themselves. The ray became the paneling, and then the next page was just pure white, and then the page following was like another string of that teleportation from like very far establishing shot, and then just a very, very close up of the guy materializing wherever he was. So like the pacing of like utilizing magic in the proper like paneling sequence or paneling types is really important to me, and I'm curious if you have an opinion on this.
I 100% agree. So something that I think is important, generally speaking, for like the health of comics is a kind of more experimental and playful use of like pages and panels. Just because I think that's where it gets exciting for me as an artist and as a reader, is to see something that's interesting or is clever or engages with the material. And I 100% think that that's a strength that a lot of fantasy artists and fantasy like comic storytellers have, is that a lot of times, because they are fringe books, because they're niche books, they can break the formula in creative ways. An example, and it's going to maybe cause some people to bristle, but example, I think that's an amazing example of the use of panels to inform the storytelling in a creative way and also in a fantastical way, is in Swamp Thing.
Okay.
Especially the run from, I think it's like 83, 84, by Alan Moore,
Mm-hmm.
and a series of fantastic artists, including John Toddleman, and it's basic, but it's a thing that's actually since then been a part of the character and above the comic, is that since it is a fringe book, they're able to incorporate like natural elements into the actual framing of panels, like where it's like, oh wow, you look at this page, it's a tree,
Mm-hmm.
and each and you know and the branches of the tree separate the panels, and it's all
Right.
in this particular page is about a family,
Mm-hmm.
and so wow, it's family tree literally.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so there's stuff like that you can use to inform it, but also what you're talking about in terms of pacing and stuff. um, I think that you can't, like I said before, you can't draw a fantasy comic like you would draw anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think um, use use consistent and bog standard panel or and panels and pacing at your peril. 'Cause I
Yeah.
think fantasy is I don't know. You need it needs to have room to breathe. It needs to feel, again, like mysterious, but also could feel like energetic
Mm-hmm.
and surprising. And you're not going to get that if you're just going to be like box 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 box
Right.
box.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or at least like like a grid. You want to
Right.
avoid that.
There's a lot of really cool I mean, obviously parallels to just like filmmaking and cinematography, and I think some of the best comics come from thinking of them as a film and making sure that your paneling and your shots. I mean, if you haven't read Scott McCloud, then what are you doing in comics?
Right.
But
Right.
if I mean, compare a comic that takes its own liberties and has fun with the paneling like that, right? Read that, and then try to read something that is literally a flat grid or 3x3 consistently and never breaks the formula. It's like you're really not going to get the engagement that you're getting from something that was really 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 planned out and thoughtfully executed. But I would argue as well that sometimes simplicity and formula can result in really cool things. I have a comic, a very large comic. Let me see what it is. It's called One Soul by Ray Fox, and the entire comic is just like a 3x4 grid. Every page, every single thing about it, and like just because of the strength of the story itself and the character designs and things, they're also simple, but it tells a solid story. There's so many aspects to a comic that very synonymously make it a difficult endeavor to accomplish well.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe on the theme of like why aren't there fantasy comics that are successful? Part of that is because fantasy in of itself is universe creation, and that adds a huge layer on top of all of the other minutia that you have to accomplish well in order to be a successful comics creator. Like,
Right.
it's such a difficult task, and I admire anyone who can put the forethought and time and effort. We have these huge studios that create Marvel movies and from A to B, A to Z, every little thing in between, and they can do it, they can pull it off because they've got millions of dollars, and they can keep us entertained, and they have QA, and they have every little man to go run and get you the coffee. Like, we don't have that.
Right.
And most fantasy artists and creators don't have that. So, yeah.
I think I think another thing to point out with, say, these things that come in other genres is, let's say science fiction, for example, is for the most part they're not about completely recreating a world or actually coming up with an original completely different world. It's about modifying the one that exists, or taking the one we live in and extrapolating into the future
Yeah.
something about it.
Right.
And so that's the thing that I think is maybe easier for a lot of people to latch onto.
Yeah, you wanna like
sci-fi is relatable.
yeah,
More, maybe.
base your weird alternate, New York world in New York, and you have unlimited reference to how to draw New York. I can't draw freaking High Hrothgar shit. Like, like I don't know what that looks like. I have to come up with that. I have to invent that.
Yeah,
and that takes time. And yeah, so
yeah,
that's
I think yeah. So I think a lot of what comes down to is I think it needs to look right, it needs to feel right, and when you're talking about using like say like a 9-panel grid to tell a story, that can work if that's the pacing that you need. If you need something that's meticulous and ordered, because that suits the scene, that suits the feel of the moment.
right.
The panels and stuff, like there's really no rules except to you know have everything in aid of the storytelling. Because I don't know, for personally, it's like if but also I will say don't be afraid of drawing attention to it, because I never feel great when I burn through a comic like super fast and I realize, oh wow, I didn't even pay attention to what I was even looking at.
Right.
Because there's plenty of people I know personally that, like, when they talk about reading a comic, I know they're barely looking at it. They're looking at it to get the basic reference point. They're looking at it for half a second before they're really thinking about
Right.
that dialogue.
Yeah.
And yeah, like there's somebody even heard recently who was like, well, this comic that is lauded and praised as one of the best of its medium is not loved because it's beautiful, and I wanted to punch them in the face. Not specifically because not only because I happen to think it is a very beautiful book, but also somebody who says that clearly has absolutely no idea what they're talking about in terms of like the hidden art of telling that story visually, because it's like you don't know any idea what's going on. Like no idea if you can say that and still pretend to recommend that book to people. Like you have no idea what you're talking about.
You have this medium, and it's this marriage of story, text, imagery, pacing. I mean, it's exactly like a film, except the film gets all this benefit from, oh, every second that I have to communicate something to you is happening real time. And you make a comic to the exact same effect, and it takes someone 8 minutes to barge through, read every word, and go, I didn't like the story. Well, did you like the art? Did you like the world? Did you like every other little piece of it? Because
did you? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that I think it's both I want to say that the benefit of a comic is that it takes a little longer than a movie, because like a movie or a show, like it's every second on film or every minute on film is super expensive because of all the stuff that goes around it. Like, yeah, you could say it's expensive time wise to make a comic, but at the very least somebody spends a little bit extra time on a page,
right?
Maybe than they would in that scene in the movie. Maybe, who knows? But
I'm gonna say it right now: if you don't read comic books 3 times over, you're not reading a comic book. You're digesting text or digesting the visual aspect of comics, or you've not even given it a good enough thought. Like, I mean, I don't read comics religiously. I have a pretty nice collection of them, and there are some that I haven't read on that shelf yet. But like, if I'm gonna sit down to read a comic, I'm gonna block out like 20 minutes, and I'm gonna read it through and then read it again, but pay a whole bunch of attention to like what's going on in the background, and like how did they accomplish this like color scheme here, and like, I mean, it's art. It's totally an art form that I think gets picked up and disposed of just because of what it is. It's a cheap piece of paper that was didn't cost someone $14. It's $3 usually, and somebody can grab that and throw it in the trash if they really want to. Like, there's nothing stopping them from doing that. And
right, yeah,
I mean, it's
one of the kind of issues with the some people have with, or it's a roadblock for that a lot of people have to getting into it. And that's really the thing, is like is coming back to kind of like the conversation, like header of where are all the fantasy comics, and also, and is like the audience needs to be there.
Yeah.
And so for a while, when I was thinking about doing like my big fantasy comic idea, I was kind of worried, like, am I creating a thing for an audience that will never find it because they aren't looking in my direction? They aren't looking for it.
Right.
And thankfully, I see people doing stuff that I really enjoy, and they have success, and they have like a fan base that is dedicated to them. People like Andrew McLean, who is responsible for Headlopper, which is a great example of a modern fantasy comic.
Absolutely.
And who, if you look at his artwork, is drawing things not like you could draw any other comic.
Yeah. And
suits his story, suits his character, suits his personality, suits the personality of the story. So I think that's a great example of it. Is that it's unique. It sets itself apart. So it makes me feel better. It's like, okay, if that can find success, I think my stuff can find success.
Yeah.
But that is the challenge. Is like, okay, how do I win over people who like enjoying their fantasy in their head?
Yeah.
And so I consciously started doing things that, like, okay, well, how would I make this appeal to me more? Like, and then so I just started refining like the way I draw and stuff to be in a way where it's like, okay, put the details where I need them, but in other places leave room for the audience to fill in the gaps. Like, don't be so meticulous with how I render the world that I can't let the audience decide something about the page, the page they need to be involved in. And that's really where it comes down, is like, is enjoy the haze and the shadow.
Yeah.
And the, where things aren't as defined, where things are still mysterious, because like, that's just my sensibility when it comes to writing kind of fantasy stuff anyway, is conceive it hard, like, know all the rules in my head, but write it soft, write it vague and mysterious, so that, because that was like a bit of advice I saw like a couple of years ago on a blog, and it was because they were responding because people were asking, like, what's better? Is it like a hard fantasy universe where like the rules are very specific, like this is possible, that is not, this is that, whatever, and where it's clearly outlined so that the audience can know, or something that's vague and nebulous, and look, I have a Mary Poppins bag, and whatever, and the best thing that I saw was conceive hard, write soft.
Yeah,
I thought that's perfect.
Super poignant.
Yeah, and also, and just because it's like, okay, cool. So then everything has reason and purpose behind it, and those who kind of look at the broad spectrum or look at the entirety of the work can figure out, oh, these seem to be like what the rules are, because this person's not able to do this here, but they are able to do something like this there. It's like, okay, so they can figure out the rules if they really want to, but also, and it gives everything a structure and makes sense of it. But it's not like giving your characters a mana bar, and a life bar, and and a what's the usual stamina bar? That's the other one. Yeah. It's not like giving you those bars, which is funny because fucking Todd McFarlane did that for Spawn. In a bunch of Spawn comics, he gives them like the HUD, power bar timer thing on his thing, and I'm just like, man, that's weird.
Yeah.
I don't know about
it's leaning into it so much, right? Like,
yeah,
I mean, there's all these rules that you want to follow, and there's all these things that you want to say about your own universe, but like, yeah, I mean, your whole poignant comment on that is make sure that you know it 95%, and then show the audience 60% of it. Like, I mean, it doesn't have to be percentages like that, but that's the general gist of the idea, right? Like, if you can codify everything to the point that you know what you're doing, and it's kind of an instinctual thing, then you're going to find success in that. You're going to find that it's easy for you to, stay true to your universe without having to like lay things out in front of everyone. It was in the last episode that we recorded, you and I, the first one, I guess, where I said I can't enjoy content that like gets up its own ass and like is so like explanatory of, well, this is how this works and this is how this works. It's like, well, let us figure that out. Let us find that out.
Or not figure it out.
Yeah, or leave it up to us to figure it out, and then like a year down the road, like say, oh yeah, everybody's like speculating on this, that this is how it is, that's how I'm gonna make it, or I'm gonna subvert everyone's expectations and change how it works. And yeah, I mean, keep it interesting, keep it lively. Fantasy is all about the imagination. I think we figured it out.
Right. Wow. What a new idea. No, it is. And I think that's it comes down to, I think people like imagining it being a part of the imagination. Cause like there's been adaptations of plenty of things in comic form. And yet people will still enjoy going back to the source material, which is usually in like prose, like just like a book or short stories or whatever.
Ooh. And you want to know what most fantasy consumers, they like the rules, they want the rules. Most people who are like investing themselves into D&D or any fantasy universe that you can be a part of and kind of come up with the terms and things, like people want to know what they are. People want to figure those things out and say like, well, I know how this is working and I'm part of it. And if you stick to those rules or cater to people who are like hungry for that, I think that could be a good formula. Like, because I'm not against rules. I think you're right. I think people enjoy figuring that stuff out, and so keeping it mysterious, keeping it to where like they have to pay attention to figure it out, it makes them rewarding for them when they're like, oh man, I totally get what's going on here. Yes. Yeah.
And cool. So I think generally speaking, I think one, and this is a topic for another conversation, which is what's responsible for this fantasy renaissance we're having now. And I have very pointed, like, it's this and that, and that's really why.
Yeah. Interesting.
Because I think we are in a bit of that right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm always game for more fantasy comics, just because the ones that I think really work are some of my favorite comics ever, because they are imaginative, they are creative, they are exciting, they're interesting, they're resonant and emotional, in a way that I'm not as connected to other comics of other genres. Like some of my favorite comics are fantasy, but other ones I enjoy are slice of life, or like the one I read last year, even though I think it came out in like 2011 or 2013, Day Tripper.
I haven't seen it yet.
Day Tripper, it's by Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba, and just incredible stuff. It's not fantasy per se, really, at all. It's about life and death and things like that, and just so creative and beautiful. And so it like I'm saying that just because it's like I'm not just focused on it's gotta be fantasy, otherwise I'm out. I'm 100% here for all sorts of things, but yeah, fantasy just kind of engages with a part of my brain that is probably gets the most excited.
Yeah.
Out of anything.
I'm gonna have to agree with you there, big time.
Yeah.
So we solved the problem. We figured it out.
I think we solved the problem. We figured out it's all you motherfuckers who don't pick up a fantasy comic book.
Get your
It's
shit
all your
together.
fault.
What hey, have you recorded any other episodes between this one and the one we recorded?
Yeah. We're on episode 5, my friend.
Ooh, baby. I'm gonna have to listen to the other ones because I'm interested in the content that you've been putting out. I need to bookmark your...
Yeah.
Oh, I need to subscribe to your YouTube channel, dude.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel that this is on. There's currently 4 up. I did 1 2-parter with my friend Ken because he and I can just talk endlessly for hours, and that's just us. And actually, I fucked up and lost half the conversation because I stopped recording at some point. Shit. But it was fine because the second half that we did instead was better than the second half that we said in the first time.
Nice.
So I did 2 with him and then 1 with my friend Jen, who I've known. She was the first person I met in college.
Cool. Heck yeah.
So yeah, we solved the problem.
We did
it's
it.
Fantasy fans, you're the worst.
Yeah, turns out that it actually is just all fantasy. Fantasy is the root genre. That's what we discovered.
It is all fantasy. At least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, change this podcast title now because
it is all just fantasy.
We figured it out. We've 5 episodes in. We can shut it down.
That's it. No, this was the main reason I started this podcast. Is like I wanted to have this conversation with somebody who I can talk to about it. So there we go. Yeah, they exist, and the good ones are especially good, and that's
yeah, absolutely. Okay,
very fruitful conversation.
I'm gonna do plugs for you because it's very important and particular to this podcast. Dan is working on a comic called Side Questers. It is going to be wonderful. It features 2 titular main characters who are honestly some of my favorite characters, despite not actually reading any of the comics, at length. I feel like I know them. I feel like I'm interested and I want to see more. So that should be a good enough pitch for you guys to go check it out whenever it gets released or published.
Yeah. I'll let people know. I will let people know about Side Questers. And of course, I got to pitch all the great work you do, like Welcome to Amara, which is a podcast, which you and a friend are playing through your fictional world of Amara.
Yes.
Which I've seen several different works. Like, didn't you have a bit on Tapas?
Yeah, it's still up there somewhere.
Yeah,
I think it's called Night Sworn. On Tapas. Should still be available. That's in the works. But
then there's a thing that we could talk about that is your brain baby.
Ooh. But
I have contributed, and as well as many of our friends.
Yes. So this brain baby is an IP that I've been developing. It started as a web game that I did development. My day job is working for a web development company in audiology, and I have used coding skills to create an interactive web page at moebiusdungeons.com. You can play a full feature roguelike monster brawler game, and Moebius is spelled Moebius, dungeons.com, and it has since that release become a collaborative infinite comic. The whole concept behind Moebius Dungeons is that you're fighting monsters and your fight is never ending until you decide to retire. So the dungeons themselves are a bit infinite. And I thought it would make a really cool collaborative comic idea. And Dan is one of the first artists, or actually was the first artist beside myself, to get involved in this collaborative comic adventure. So it's a lot of fun. The world is ever growing and has no limitations, and it's just placed in this infinite dungeon where anything can happen. And artists take turns creating pages. I actually got the idea from another comic called Spira, which was a very similar idea. It wasn't an infinite dungeon, but it was collaborative comic making. So check out Spira, check out Moebius Dungeons. There's a lot going on. I think we're going to publish the comic on the website here soon, probably within a few months.
Right, yeah, because you wanted to just wait until we got 20 pages in, and it looks like I'm going to be responsible for getting us over that mark.
Yep.
Because I couldn't help but follow you again when you had your second set of, because everybody gets 2 pages, I did 3 and 4, and then you're doing, is it 17, 18?
Yep. So you have 19 and 20. So yeah,
19, 20. Yeah,
you're going to be the 20th.
But you're not gonna. I mean, I don't know. You might be able to predict what I'm gonna do, but you probably. But I don't know. You may not. You may not.
I've still got 18 to do. I just finished the inks on 17 today.
Looks great, by the way.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I mean that's going to be live very soon. You can play the game now, but keep tabs out and check out moebiusdungeons.com for updates and stuff like that. We'll be releasing the comic very soon.
Very exciting. Very exciting. So yes, there is great fantasy comics out there.
We got to make them.
We just have to make them. That's really what we've figured it out. That's what we really
That's the second solution.
That's the second solution is we just have to do it. Just all right, everybody, fine.
Move aside.